Hi everyone. Welcome to an episode of the Friday's Times. I'm your host Elia Ayoub, and I'm joined with your other host Ayman Makarem, who's the host of Politically Depressed as well. We are going to talk about Lebanon, where we're both from, and the reason why, at least the Friday's Times has been on hiatus for the past couple of weeks. Politically Depressed has actually been hyperproductive. We are going to talk about Lebanon. Both of us are very frustrated, to put it very mildly, at how Lebanon is often covered. At the very least in the Anglophone press. Honestly, Francophone is slightly better at times, but not often. And obviously because we need to talk about it and things are bad and we have some background that we can share, and we're going to go through a century of Lebanese history, more or less. The further back we go, the vaguer it will get, at least, but we'll do our best. And yeah, Ayman.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for doing this with me. I think we both definitely have, obviously, the current situation is terrifying and horrible, but on top of that, there's just this, we've been seeing it with Palestine, but Palestine, there definitely is more of a, I don't know, public, global consciousness around it. Whereas Lebanon, it's also I'm not gonna say more complex, but it's a shit show, and most people don't know it, and especially now them knowing it through Zionism, through the state of Israel, the aggression. It's I don't know. It's not a very good entry point, let's say, and I see a lot of people just there's it is difficult. It's a very, very weird country. And so I thought it would be a good idea to sit together and just, yeah, share our understandings of our history. We are both not just Lebanese, but we're also like on the left, broadly speaking, which I think brings with it a different reading of the history compared to what you would get, I don't know, if you're on Wikipedia or just this kind of basic overviews. There's a lot of like Lebanese history that I've only discovered in the last 2 or 3 years
Oh
that
yeah,
has
me
like
too.
completely, yeah,
With a PhD on post-war Lebanon, and genuinely towards the end, still things reading that blows my mind,
yeah,
because it's such a fucking small country, not that many people, and yet it just gets more and more complicated. Not always, obviously. And when we say complicated, we don't mean that it's like obscure knowledge that no one can really understand or whatever. It just
no, yeah,
there are lots of actors, and
there are a lot
that
of
changes a
actors.
lot with time. And the same actors can have the same name after like 10 years, but have different politics. That sort of thing. It does not help that most of for example, in the Civil War, most of the militias choose like the same 4 or 5 words
Yeah,
for like their
yeah.
names and shit. So this confuses things even more. But yeah, we'll get into that. We'll get into that.
We'll get into that. So what I proposed and what we're gonna run with is that we're gonna break it up into 30-minute chunks. To my knowledge, one of the best English language books on the topic is Fawwaz Traboulsi's The Modern History or the History of Modern Lebanon. And based on that, he situates the sort of beginning, because obviously there is no beginning, but within limits, the best beginning to sort of describe the modern history of Lebanon starts with the 1860s.
Yeah.
And so we will talk about starting from the 1860s until independence, 1944. That'll be half an hour, reflecting also the fact that, yeah, we're not historians, we're not Ottoman historians. I don't have that much detailed knowledge about this era. The next half an hour, we'll talk about 44 till 75, so independence until the beginning of what will be known as the Lebanese Civil Wars. And then, oh, I guess till 90, till the end.
And the end of the war, yeah. In
Yeah, till
1990, and
1990.
then the post-war.
And then the post-war, another half an hour, because that's the one that we grew up in, but also
Yeah.
it's the thing that's like more relevant.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think just as a sort of small disclaimer for people, or the opposite of a disclaimer, kind of what you'd benefit from this. It's not just a history lesson. We are both very much so rooted in the present moment. And so oftentimes we'll be talking about something, we will bring it back to, why are we even bringing this up?
Yeah.
Because of what's happening today, a
Yeah.
misunderstanding today, or, So, yeah, let's start with the sort of 1860s. Lebanon is one of the states under the Ottoman Empire. It's not a state. It doesn't have that
regions.
formality. One of the regions, broad sort of, which basically constitutes Mount Lebanon, the Ba'a, and the coastal regions. And yeah, I don't know. Do you want to start with that? Share sort of.
My rough understanding of the late 1800s and the way I think to make it as a non-historian of that period, to make it more relevant in many ways, to connect it to not necessarily the present, but at the very least the more recent past, is that the 1860s is in many ways the beginning of the idea of a Lebanon. The roots, I don't know how far back one can go. You would have arguments from the historiography, so how history is written. You'd have arguments of someone calling themselves Lebanese in certain contexts, even going further back. But roughly speaking, it's like towards the late 1800s. The 1860s, when you had a civil war. And you had, it's called that in any case. It doesn't quite compare to this 1975, 1990 period that more people, I think, would be at least more familiar with. But it's where you start seeing the roots of sectarianism, not sectarianism in this cultural sense of one sect versus another or whatever, but like as a political system. The 1860s, when you start seeing the roots of what we call sectarianism with the first civil war that, very roughly speaking, if you have more details, go for it, pitted the Druze overlords or the landlords at the time with the Maronite working class, for lack of a better term, which is not something that would then be replicated later on. It's just something that wasn't a thing of the 1860s.
Yeah. This is described as the Mountain Wars because Mount Lebanon is predominantly Druze and Maronite Christian. And I think it's important to note as well, as a sort of demography, geography, again, I'm avoiding calling it a country or a state because it's sort of anachronistic.
Yeah.
There was no full whatever. That sort of area, there is a huge mix of different religious groups, of different ethnicities, of very different geographies as well, that the way that people lived in Traboulsi and the coast, and their economic relations and their just way of life is very different. But for the most part, we're talking about societies that are predominantly agricultural, mercantile, because Lebanon is and has always been like a trade route between East and West, but also specifically between like Persia or the sort of inner Levant. And so under the Ottomans, I think this is very important to note because at this point in the 1860s, Lebanon had already been under Ottoman rule for like 400 years, 300. It was one of the first, the Levant is one of the first territories that the Ottomans had controlled. And this comes on the back of centuries of just like swapping hands.
I think we should say, Ayman, even when we say the Levant, what we mean, because it's in modern day terms, it's roughly the area that on the map would consist of like Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine. In some maps, I would see Jordan or parts of Jordan included. But that's basically it.
Yeah. So like when I look at this history more, I think like beyond or like even before these nationalisms, there existed more of a kind of cosmopolitanism wherein, and I don't mean this in terms of like globalness, but cities. And so what I would consider the Levant is like kind of starting from the north with like Aleppo and Latakia, going down south, Tripoli and Homs, and then Beirut, Damascus. There's obviously like inner Syria, but again, this is how I think of the Levant, all the way down to Gaza, and Amman would be a part of it, but I wouldn't consider like the sort of, that very colonial straight line of Jordan.
Yeah.
But so these are broadly, the categories, the sort of topographies I'm talking about when I talk about the Levant. And still to this day, so much connections of it's the same accent or very similar dialect specifically. Sorry, the accents definitely change. But in Arabic, Bled al-Sham, the Levant, dialects are all kind of interwoven. The cuisine, the traditional dress, again, differences, but so yeah.
Yeah,
So okay, that's a
differences
good point.
between the countries that are not that dissimilar from differences within them. So, like, North and
Yeah.
South Lebanon and whatever, then you would have certain things of South Lebanon that are more quote unquote Palestinian, at least
Mm,
resemble historically, that sort of thing, because nation states are a modern phenomenon.
yeah, very modern, even the European ones, and I think we'll get to
Yeah, yeah,
this.
yeah.
But I make a point of saying this, mentioning this cosmopolitanism, because it is more connected to the history that you have these Syrian writers, but this is a time before Syria, and they identify as like a Halabi or a Damascene thing or a Saida or something. Anyway, and so, but under the Ottomans, this is very important because I see a lot of misreadings, sometimes very intentionally, of colonialism. So the Ottoman Empire stretched massive swaths of territory, lasted for hundreds of years, but it was very different than, let's say, the French or the British. Um, First of all, like they borrowed our script, but I don't know many people in Lebanon that speak Turkish, and
Mhm.
for being ruled 400 years, and there wasn't that same imposition of a certain culture of ideals or whatever. And
It, it
so
it did change with time. It's important to say it got more oppressive in the later decades, especially. But yes, it is. It's not as let's say a clean or a straightforward colonial history as, like, the colonial officers in the capital and they're just extracting wealth or whatever. It wasn't. It was much more messy than that, and in many ways more heterogeneous than that.
Yeah, exactly. And but one effect that it definitely had, and it's very, very evident in Lebanon, but also I see this a lot in the Balkan region, some of the connections, because they didn't have Turkish troops. I mean, okay, they did, but the ways that they ruled these areas is not by, I mean, there was no settler colonialism, and there wasn't even that strong of a kind of central apparatus. They had their guy on the block. They had their people there. And for Lebanon, for Mount Lebanon, it was the Druze. And I say this with a bit of a smirk because I'm of this
Yeah, folks should know
ethno.
this, that it's just funny between me and Ayman because I'm Maronite and he is Druze, so this is just very funny for us.
Yeah, the 1860s, a bloody war though. It's
Yeah, it
terrible.
was,
It's
yeah.
but the Druze were basically, yeah, the tax collectors,
Hmm.
because the Druze, even though we're not Muslim, we're seen as close enough to. Okay, there's an argument there. There are some that claim that we are, but we're definitely more Muslim than the Christians, and so we were the tax collectors of this region and the kind of cop on the block. And there is not just a civil war that happens in the mountains, but also, and this I don't know the history too well. I really hope you do. Certain actions, certain figures that basically claimed certain amounts of autonomy in specifically what is now Lebanon from the Ottomans.
Oh yeah, it's part of the mythology, Fakhiddin, all of that stuff. There's very much it's more myth than fact as far as I can tell, but it's one of those things that the further back you go, maybe the differences between those two don't matter as much because it is about the story. But my understanding is that you started having these kind of rebellious leaders that were resisting the Turks, or whatever, in various formats. And you see those kind of romanticized in, my thing is cinema. So in the movies of the 60s and 70s, you have a couple
Mm,
of them. Fairouz is in one of them, that sort of thing. Um, it's interesting, even in those, you would have a proto-nationalism that's kind of represented, but not necessarily a Lebanese one. It's more of a Shami one. In that Fairouz film, I think it's Safar Barlek, if I'm not mistaken,
yeah,
the Syrian man is a sympathetic figure, which is like
fair.
unheard of in most Lebanese cinema, since the 60s and 70s. But anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
I digress.
And especially a film that has a very like Maronite Christian,
Yeah,
um, what's the word? Like hegemonic idea. And again, this is of a time wherein, okay, we'll get to that in a bit,
we'll get to that
but
in a
it's
bit. Yeah.
very interesting. Not just the Syrian man, but also all the kafiyas and the
Hmm.
very idea of the resistor. Um, but yeah, I'm reading now a bit more about this history, and one of the biggest rebellions against the Turks, much more so with the French, yeah, or Druze from Majd el Shams, very
Hmm.
specifically.
Hmm.
And that's kind of erased because this is a sort of more transnational thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, and at the same time, though, with the sort of preferential treatment, let's say, of Druze Lebanese or Druze Levantines,
The distinction at the time, we should say, between the word Syria and the word Lebanon was pretty blurry. Like you would have maybe more famously later on, like Khalil Gibran, who's like, maybe the more well-known Lebanese American poet, when he would be writing, like during the famine of Mount Lebanon of roughly a century ago, he would be talking about like, please save Mount Lebanon, save the people, save our people of Syria. Like those terms were interchangeable for basically most of our history.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that comes later. That's a very important, like, it comes with sort of Western colonialism for sure, but you do see some of these roots. And again, I think something that's really important why we're doing this is because nationalism, much like most ideologies, project itself backwards. And so, yeah, now you talk about Khalil Gibran, the Lebanese poet, regardless of how he even identified or how or the current that existed at the time, which for a long time there is, and then later on also does get very problematic. We will get to that, hopefully, that there is so much more in common than differences between Lebanon and Syria, but also specifically with Syria that's like more Eastern. All these nations that are formed aren't formed on, I mean, all nations are made up communities or all imagined communities, but yeah, I don't want to get too deep into that aspect of things. But regardless, enough to say, at the time as well, there started being more Western missionaries, specifically that would go and, make connections with Lebanese Christians.
Yeah.
And this
is important. There's a reason why that was facilitated and why like Lebanon and what became Lebanon, so specifically in this case, Mount Lebanon and Beirut had a bit of a privileged status, if that's the right term, I'm not entirely sure, that even Armenians didn't have in the same way, even though Armenians also are Christians, is that most Lebanese Christians are Catholics. And Maronites are Catholics. Maronites is a church that is aligned with the Catholic Church, is in communion, they would say, or we would say, whatever. Yeah. And that means that like there are centuries of Maronite bishops and archbishops and what have you who would go to Rome, to the Vatican, and be part of that communion. And so there's a bit of a kind of a parallel history that is a religious history, obviously, but that fed into this proto-nationalism later on.
Yeah. But also there's a bit of geopolitics playing on here because this was a way of like penetrating the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
And there were, what's the word? Not secessions, but there were treaties between the Ottoman Empire and like to be like, okay, we'll take care of them a bit, you fuck off. I don't know this history very well, but there's definitely the early signs of like the French, sort of, not just French, also Italians. And in the same way that Orientalism and then Western colonialism happened, some of it did just start with missionaries, started with artists, started with travelers. And some of the very early, what are described like the early modern Lebanese artists were trained by Italian missionaries and then brought back to Rome and brought back to Florence and whatever, like Dawood Korm, for instance. But so, yeah. And you did also have like a kind of growing coastal mercantile bourgeoisie, those that were more in terms of trade, and again, a lot of these were Christian families, Sunni as well. I think we should mention as well, so like, because we're trying to do an overview, that yes, there are Maronite Christians, there are also many types of Orthodox Christians.
When there's other Catholics as well. Maronites are just the biggest ones in terms of percentage.
Yeah. And the Druze, very small percentage, mostly in the mountains, a break off from not just Islam, but a break off from Shia Islam, and a very strange group of people. But I think because of their sort of beneficent, like how we benefited from the Ottoman rule, are still to this day kind of kingmakers, like sort of disproportionate to our size. But also, yeah, there is a geography to it, right? That like for connections between Damascus and Beirut, well, more historically Damascus and Saida and Damascus and Tripoli, you kind of have to go through Mount Lebanon.
Yep.
And so there is still like a geography that's like important to note there. Sunni, obviously Sunni Muslim, which again in this sort of area is not the sort of main hegemonic like you have in most of the Arab world. And so of the sort of main class like groups, you have it's mostly Maronite, Sunni, and then a bit in the Druze.
Yeah.
I'll mention why I'm bringing this up later on.
Yes.
But again, I think it's really important to note here that in the beginnings, that there's not this, we are sectarian, the society is ordered around sectarianism, and therefore there was a political system to match that. The opposite.
Yeah.
This is why I like Fawwaz Traboulsi's readings of history as a Marxist historian, because he looks at the 1860s and he looks at it from a class perspective. Who owns the means of production? Who are literally the landowners? Who are supported by empire? Who are the downtrodden? And what is the sort of conflicts that's sort of moving this history? And yeah, I think that's just really important to note, because a lot of the ways that sectarianism presents itself, but also the way that it's read, is as a religious conflict, but it is just not. And there are just too many examples to name, but we will go through it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think there is that slow development. First of all, also the collapsing Ottoman Empire by the early 1900s, very much in debt, very much kind of collapsing, not able to keep up with expansionist Western, specifically European industrialization and expansion. And
you had the rise of the various nationalisms in the Balkans and Greece, of course, that, wanted to break away from the Ottomans, and progressively the territory became smaller and smaller and smaller until World War One, obviously.
Yeah. And even within what is now Turkey, you had a nationalist movement, which there's a whole history to be read about there, which I don't know very much about. But there's also like a growing nationalism in opposition to the Ottomans within the Arab regions more broadly.
Yeah.
And so I think we then can jump to the First World War, which obviously it's a fucking world war. There's a lot specific for what we're talking about. Obviously Ottoman Empire with Germany and Italy, Austria-Hungary, and no, Italy was
I should know what
with
the answer. We don't care.
We don't care, whatever, it's fine. But functionally, yeah, the Ottoman Empire was like already struggling, and
it collapsed with the First World War.
It collapsed, and part of the reason it collapsed, if anyone has seen Lawrence of Arabia, is because that Arab nationalism that was like sort of rampant throughout the region made allies with the European powers that were against the Ottomans and took up arms, and essentially helped the overthrow of the Ottoman Empire, which I think that is that is the premise of the film Safar Barlek. It's about that period. Important to note here, because this is a very like oftentimes, what's the word like rolled over part of our history, is the famine.
Yeah.
Which by some estimates killed 50% of the inhabitants of Mount Lebanon. And
we did an episode on the Far East Times with Lina, Mounzer, and Timour Azhari, for those who are interested. I think it was 2021. I think we did it that was this centennial. Sorry.
Yeah, check it out, because like honestly, we were not taught this history. There are certain things that, it's not. And again, you watch Safar Barlek, it is during the famine. Safar Barlek is the name of a train that would take the flour away or whatever, and conscriptions and whatever. But no one's hungry. Everyone is full. There's even a song where she comes in and she says, was it, ahlul dar, tamu, no tamu. It's like they're eating.
Like, feed us, yeah.
Yeah, but people resorted to cannibalism. It was horrible. Yeah. And it was a joint of many factors, but one of which is like the Turkish movement of supplies to the war front.
Yeah. As well as the role of class. The Sursur family and the allies, I forgot which Sursur it was, who were allies with the Ottoman elites at the time. One of the best examples, Lina Mounzer has an excellent essay on this. That's how I invited her, and Timour Azhari, the journalist, also had written a piece. I believe it was for New Lines at the time when I had them on, so I had both of them on. There was this guy whose name currently I'm spacing out on, but he hoarded grain. And that's because he was making a profit out of this artificial scarcity. So it's one of those examples. Was like, yes, there was a resource problem, and to make things much worse, there was a quite literal like infestation by, I think it was crickets or something, that devastated the crops. Locust, yeah. That devastated the crops. But it was also artificially worsened, effectively, for, well, price gouging, to make things good.
There was also a Western blockade. It's a lot of stuff, but specifically
at the same time. Yeah.
So that's huge. And it's definitely like a thing that I like Lina Mounzer describing Lebanon as a community of joint grief, because I think that's sort of one of the first major things. Again, I remember my grandfather once, I was eating an olive and I spat out the pit and I put it in the ashtray. And he looked at me and he wasn't scolding me. He was just teaching. He was just like, do you know what my grandmother used to do with the olive pit? I was like, what? He said, when you'd finish the olive, she would get a piece of bread. And our bread is very like malleable, but it's paper-like.
Pita bread, they would call them in the West.
Hella, but no, because they confuse it with the Turkish pita, which is actually quite
that's true.
Like thick. But anyway, basically she would rub the pit and eat the bread. And she would do this until the pit was completely dry. And this is my grandfather talking about his grandmother, who lived through the famine. And I just found that haunting. But anyway, we should
the famine is why we had one of the main reasons why we have a massive diaspora, the Lebanese diaspora, especially to the Americas. That's why I have the Argentinian citizenship, fourth generation of Argentinians. The movie Elia and Ayman, Where To, is partly based on that history, set in the late 1800s. It's kind of, let's say it's if you want to use it in terms of like a timeline, it's like the first big chapter of Lebanon in terms of a history.
The first wave of migration, that is very important to note, actually.
Yeah. Which was largely to the Americas, not to North US or to North America or to Europe. It was to Brazil and to Argentina.
Yeah, I've got family in Venezuela.
Yeah.
To this day, I still get emails from some Ayman Makarem who works at a oil thing in Venezuela. I swear to God, I get funny emails that's like clearly not meant for me. But anyway, so then after the war, after the Ottoman Empire collapses, you have 3 major documents, treaties, agreements, colonial treaties, which are the Sykes-Picot agreement between literally a guy named Sykes and a guy named Picot, the French and the British, divided up. They betrayed the Arabs. The Arabs were like, we want nationalism. They're like, oh, okay, great, but y'all are still like subhuman, so we're going to take over some of these areas. We're going to draw the borders.
Fight with us to defeat the Ottomans. We'll give you something in return, and then they don't.
They got something. I mean, they got Jordan.
Or like Jordan, the Saudis, whatever. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But also the borders we know now, and this honestly still breaks my brain because it's like we are still living this 100-year history since the First World War, which is the borders we have now. When we talk about Lebanon, when we talk about Syria, when we talk about Jordan or Palestine, those borders are colonial borders.
Yes.
They're not based on actually whatever. Like I get Lebanon, Mount Lebanon, whatever, but...
No, but Mount Lebanon and Beirut were not enough to sustain themselves, so they had to expand them and include the Ba'a and the north and the south, because otherwise they can't eat.
It's not a country. Yeah. But then even then, there's so many, like, there were some ideas then of even dividing that.
Yes.
And to have basically like a Druze area, a Damascus area, a Beirut area. So these weren't the only options. There were other colonial options as well. But regardless, this is what we have. The Balfour Declaration is also a really important one that's not tied in. People try to talk about Lebanon sometimes in a silo, but it's just so connected. It's the same imperialist powers. It's the same treaties that divide. This is Lebanon. This is Palestine. And then the Balfour Declaration, that created a national home for the world's Jewish people in Palestine. And there were already settlements, but this is the period when it starts increasing. For the part of Lebanon, the French take over. And in why I emphasized at the beginning that in the Ottoman era, there wasn't that same Western form of colonialism. And even in the Western form, there's a big difference because the French did have a very strong idea of mission, like a civilisatrice or whatever.
Mission
civilizing mission.
civilisatrice, literally a civilizing mission, yeah.
And so they're there as the big brother. They're taking care of us until we can become independent. And while they're doing that, they're teaching everyone French, they're opening schools, they're building infrastructure in specific areas, definitely not in the far south or north, mostly in Beirut, mostly in kind of Christian areas in Mount Lebanon. And specifically and very importantly, they do a census in 1933, because obviously the French have had a long history with the Maronites, specifically, again, the Maronite elite, because I emphasize this because it's not like the French are going into the village square in Batroun and all the people are like, oh, yeah, you're our guy.
No, it's an aristocracy that has that is mostly Maronite and to lesser extent Sunni, mostly Beirut based. It's like a coastal elites, you might say, but that even historically is some of them are intermarried with royalties of Europe. Lady Cochrane, related to the Sursur family, and there was the links to the elites of the Ottomans that were themselves linked to the Venetians, and it's aristocracy. It's just that it helped formed, if you want, at least it was part of this proto formation of what would end up becoming the upper class in Lebanon at the time.
Yeah. And again, specifically, these are sectarian elites, right? These are the aristocracy that are sort of, it was mostly, this I find very important actually. Beirut at the time was a shit town. It was nothing. It was a port. It was like a port with some farms and some whatever.
Yeah.
This is the period that it starts to really be built up as a main thing to compete with Tripoli. Because Tripoli would have been naturally, if there was a capital city of this area or whatever, or its own thing.
Yeah.
But Beirut, by its access to Mount Lebanon, but also its demography. And so you start getting these people who benefit greatly from French colonialism. And in 1933, the French do a census. And here, I think this is very important. They do a census. And the census is quite an authoritarian practice in the colonies. Everyone has to stay at home. There's a curfew. And people go door to door asking them, where are you from? What's your sect? And whatever. And this is the census. I think is it the last census we ever...
It's
like
the first and only one.
And it says that there's 33% Maronite. Like, functionally, most importantly, majority Maronite. And so then, on that basis, accordingly, they start beefing up the Maronite elite, claiming this is the main group, and essentially, you're really forming the sectarianism. They create laws in this period that are still enforced. Notably, from my perspective, the law against homosexuality is codified in this period.
Yeah, and they use the formulation of acts against nature is how the French formulated, which is to this day still in the Lebanese legal code. Because it's so vague, you've had some progressive judges basically saying, well, in nature you do have same-sex relation, therefore it is not against nature, blah, blah, blah. But yes, it's still very much with us.
But so this is colonialism, and the French want to be able to control this region, have access to it. There's obviously, it's not like we have minerals or resources, but it's sort of an area and whatever. It's definitely like geographically very vital, like an access to the Middle East. And so then who are their guys? The Maronite Christian elite, who them in themselves see, through this imperial power, we can then be top dog in this area. And so what is this area we can be top dog in? This is Lebanon.
Yeah.
And so then I think you can kind of fast forward a bit. I think the 1936 Palestinian Arab Revolt is very important. I don't know how much it fully ties into with Lebanon. Definitely a lot of the Palestinian leadership of that revolt were exiled into Lebanon, into Jordan,
My
what is
understanding
now
is
Lebanon.
that Beirut as a cultural city already had some kind of influence. Beirut by then was already becoming kind of a bit of this hub along with Cairo and Alexandria in terms of the wider region, I mean. And so being the closest one of those three, you would have a lot of those, especially those who were exiled, who would have gone to Beirut.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's hard to sum this up, but definitely Beirut changes a lot in this period.
Yes.
And one big thing is the American University, which I think started as a missionary.
It was called the Syrian Protestant College. What
Yeah,
was the
yeah.
origin? But that's the example is Syrian. Again, the term between what is Lebanese and what is Syrian was always, at the time in any case, was interchangeable.
And so you really had a burgeoning elite, and also an artistic scene and a political scene. And people like Mustafa Fakhour, شو اسمه فخر,
I think that's what.
Dawood Korm. There were a bunch of them doing arts, and some of it's interesting, but I don't want to have suggested that it's like feudalism until 1944.
No, no.
But by the beginning of the Second World War, and again, the Second World War, there was fighting in the Arab region, for sure. Again, this is impossible to sum up in just a few minutes. But specific for us,
Well, Lebanon declares independence in 43, but because by then it was Vichy France, so it was the collaborationists, the Nazi allied government. Effectively, although they declared independence in 43, it didn't really make much of a difference until 45, so until the end of the Second World War. And that's when you started the second phase, if you want to put it that way, of the modern state of Lebanon, with Charles al-Khouri being the first president, Riyad al-Salah the first prime minister.
and very important to note, what is the way that they unify this country politically is through the sectarian system.
Yeah.
And mostly it's a power sharing. It's not power sharing. This again, I've only learned in the last few years, and Mehdi Amil is the only person I've ever read that like just sums it up so concisely that sectarianism is a system of control by sectarian elites, specifically of a sect. And in the beginning, it's the Maronites. And you have these smaller sects, not smaller in terms of population, but in terms of power, who attach themselves to that power. And any sectarian conflict they're in is about who gets more power.
Yeah.
But so basically, I think, again, this is really important because most people understand their own societies and societies writ large as, conflicts of class or of a monarchy and the people, or of the bourgeoisie and the working class. And all of these are obviously very.
There's an element of that, yeah.
There's a big element of that, and it's not this thing of like we are by our nature sectarian. Rather, this is the way that the sort of neo-colonial elite were able to rule the country and legitimize themselves by adopting this form of
the process, like in the literature, the process is called sectarianization. Like it's something that gets created, that is not just gets created, but that has to be replicated. Like it doesn't just exist in the ether. It has to be reproduced, like every day, every month, every year, every what have you. Yeah. And that is through this power sharing agreement. But today, like I'm not gonna skip ahead too much, but like it doesn't just exist. Like today, you wake up and it's like, oh, I am Druze and I'm going to interact with the Shia, my Shia neighbor as a Druze, and he is Shia or she is Shia, whatever. It's not a interpersonal necessarily relationship in that sense, but it is one that is legally codified and therefore organizes relations in a certain way. And because it's legally codified, it has all of those other reverberations in terms of owning land and shit like that, which has obviously impacts to this day.
It's how we relate to the state. We relate to the state through the sectarian system. So quite literally, if I vote, even though I've lived my whole life in Beirut, I vote in my father's village. And the relegation of what, in most countries is relegated to like the ministry of the government of the state is relegated to the mayor. The mayor isn't the right word, but is the top dog in my dad's village.
Yeah.
And so that's obviously patriarchy. And that I won't speak too much on, but it's a very interesting book. I don't understand half of it. Is Sextarianism.
Sextarianism, Maya Mikdashi.
Maya Mikdashi. And so she sums up this history very well. Also sums up the census very well, because again, that's really important. And again, I think a lot of people, we still don't know how many people live where, but it doesn't matter. There's still a misreading of, well, they did a census, they found that it's majority Christian, so they should get the most amount of power. And so indeed, what did happen is that after the Second World War, after independence, there was this national bloc that connected Christian elites with Sunni elites, and cut up the country politically in
terms of a gentleman's agreement between the elites of Beirut, especially, of how to organize the rest of Lebanon effectively, excluding basically anyone who's not Sunni and Christian. It did include some Druze, and like one or two in the representation of Shias, but disproportionately excluding the Shias, especially of South Lebanon, which is important, like not to foreshadow too much, but it's important to understand the later history of the South, which is part of the historical resentment that helped fuel in the birth of Hezbollah, obviously, later on.
Yeah, slow down,
yes.
But so quite literally, the president has to be, this isn't written, like you said, it's a gentleman's agreement, and it still holds, the president has to be Maronite Christian. The prime minister has to be Sunni. At the time, was the spokesperson for the parliament Shia?
The speaker of parliament, that's a good question. I think it may have been added on later. I think it was part of the agreements of having a better proportional system to include Shias that were excluded previously, but I'm not entirely sure of when that started. The joke among Lebanese is that it was always Nabi Haberi because he has been around forever.
And you see photos of him from like 40 years ago. He still looks 80 years old, and he's still 80, and he's not dying. But I think the speaker was a Shia, but it was just like they had no power. They were the Speaker of the House.
Oh yeah, no, that's for sure. The power of the the power of the president was by far the executive was very strong, and the power of the executive is one of the things that was reduced after the civil war. But that's like later.
Yeah. And so then 1944, and you have this agreement. And again, also then how many members of parliament, how many members of whatever, these are all cut into quotas based on sectarian lines. Yeah. And the majority, or for the most part, the largest thing, was reserved for Maronite Christians.
Yes.
Who at the time were also some of the most organized in terms of political parties. Specifically, and here we start naming some of the political parties because they're already formed and whatever.
Yeah.
I mentioned the National Bloc, even though, but also Kataib,
the Phalangists.
Which is the Phalange. For anyone who knows the Spanish Phalange, they were quite literally like Maronite supremacists.
They were named after the Spanish Phalanges of Franco. So Pierre Gemayel, the founder of both of the Gemayel clan and of the Kataib, was at the Nazi Olympics in Berlin in 1936. He liked what he saw.
Yeah, he liked what he saw. There's another guy who was very inspired by the same people, but he tries to write about them a bit more critically, who is Antoine Saadeh.
Of course. Founder of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, SSNP.
Yeah.
Which people who are listening to this, if you want to pause a second, Google their flag.
Google their flag. It's sad though. Actually, wait, before you Google the flag, because my grandfather was a member, but it's like, it was very different. This is a political party that is formed by quite a kooky kind of intellectual thinker who was Greek Orthodox. And it was a political party that the main thing was, it was kind of anti-colonial. It was like saying, these are not our borders. These are imposed borders, and we want to unify with Syria. And it had a lot of socialist aspects. It had a lot of whatever. It definitely is now just a bullshit political party that has nothing. It's just thugs in Ras Beirut.
That literally kind of like an appendage of Hezbollah and co. I don't know what they stand for, to be honest.
But my main experience with them, I remember once literally being at the Khadarji, like the grocer, buying stuff, and these two guys come in. I can see the star. I can see the hurricane necklace.
the not swastika.
The not swastika hurricane, yeah. And they straight up like intimidate the guy the guy I remember so well, he brought like 5 kilos of bananas, and the guy's like, okay, that's going to be 10,000 lira. And he's like, make it 2,000. And they literally intimidated him, and they have a presence in Ras Beirut, and there's definitely whatever. Regardless, definitely a party that's like more of a coalition at the time, especially of groups that didn't quite fit into some of these molds. I don't know if the PSP is founded yet.
No,
we'll get to that in a
it's with
second.
Kamal Jumblatt.
Yeah. So yeah, you have this power sharing agreement of the sort of sectarian elite. Lebanon then also economically becomes a financial hub, kind of like what Dubai is today, except without the hideous buildings. But the banking sector
The banking, yeah, you're gonna say that.
becomes huge. And again, because it is a way of connecting funds and finances, whatever, between East and West. I'm using quotation marks because it's something we hear all the time, but quite literally, Lebanon in the like 60s has insane amounts of banks. Insane. And also, it's important to note here is what happens in 1948, the Nakba. And so you have a lot of Palestinians coming to Lebanon.
Yeah. Very shortly after the state of Lebanon exists in formation, so it very much like almost immediately at the part of the history is linked in that sense.
Yeah.
My grandfather
quite literally.
is among them, and he becomes Lebanese later on.
What's really important about this as well, and why I want to bring in a kind of, again, leftist perspective, as opposed to just like a kind of nominal, the Palestinians came as a national group, whatever, is like everybody was kicked out of Palestine. Like you had 800,000 kicked out. So many went to Lebanon, many went to Jordan, many went into the diaspora.
And Syria.
And Syria, of course. And so with that, Palestine as a whole society, which also had classes, and you also had people who left even before the Nakba, but also you had people of the Palestinian bourgeoisie who then sort of went to Lebanon.
Yeah.
And I bring this up very importantly because one of the main bankers of this time was a Palestinian man. I forget his name.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. But he was among those. Wasn't he the one who was selling a lot of lands to the the JNF?
Oh, he might have been. I mean, I want to mention actually the Sursuk family, one of the biggest.
family.
They sold. They were absentee landlords in Palestine and sold land to the early Zionist settlers to the Jewish National Fund.
The museum with the stained glasses that were done by my mom.
Yeah. No, I love Lebanon sometimes because honestly, it is just this kind of thing of like everyone has a connection in some way to something else. And
because it is so small. That's the thing, and because it's we talked about this a bit anyway. But its location has meant that it was a hub for a lot of different things, good and bad. Obviously, you mentioned the banks. Like just as a brief like parentheses, there's a book called Banking on the State by Hisham Safieddine. Have issues with his politics, but whatever. The what's interesting about the 50s and 60s is that Lebanon was kind of the outlier in the rest of the region. You had the rise of Nasserism, of Pan-Arabism, that had an element of state socialism with it, and Lebanon didn't. And Lebanon very much was like, also hosted in some cases exiles from Egypt, for example. A lot of Egyptians started coming to Lebanon at that time, especially the middle and upper classes. That's among the reasons why you started having this kind of booming cinema that was very Egyptian, but based in Lebanon, that sort of thing. Good and bad with all of this. But among the things that happened is you had a huge influx of capital from the rest of the region into Lebanon, because that was in many ways, the banking system of the region. You even have the Syrian Lebanese Bank, or whatever it's called, or Banque Syro-Liban, whatever it's called, which is a very old one, which was among the many ways the Assad regime at the time was able to whitewash its money, launder its money. A lot of these things happen, and Lebanon was very happy to present itself as like, again, the funny thing about, for those who don't know, it was called kind of the Switzerland of the Middle East, which is one of the most irritating things ever. But one of the funniest thing about this is, why was it called? It's because the banking secrecy laws in Lebanon, because you were able, whoever you are from almost wherever in the world, especially obviously from the region, that you put your money in Lebanese banks and no questions asked. And so, I just wanted to end kind of this parenthesis. Because yeah,
Yeah. The banking secrecy law, which still exists to this day and was a huge subject of protest in 2019 when things collapsed. But anyway, so the banking on the state, I completely agree about Hisham Safieddine's politics, but the book is very good and definitely is a very interesting way of understanding Lebanese history and Lebanese nationalism because it is through the economic policies and ideologies essentially that Lebanon starts kind of forming more of a, for that period we had the same currency.
yes,
And so then by declaring our own currency, I think in the 50s, I want to say somewhere around
something like
50
that. Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
That's a thing of we are our own thing.
Yeah.
But there's also this discussion of should we have our own central bank? But yeah, very much a lot of the problems that we have in Lebanon today and for the last few years finds its roots here in the formation of this kind of proto-neoliberal financialized economy.
Yeah, and neoliberalism before neoliberalism in some sense.
Yeah. And again, because most of the society was quite, agricultural.
Yeah.
Or at least kind of like petit bourgeois mercantile, whatever, but especially in the South, especially in the North. And yeah, you have a list of presidents. Again, what I find very interesting and I want to mention to people is how we're taught this in school is we get to independence. Like there's like, we read the history, independence. And then all we're taught is the names of the presidents and prime ministers until the modern day.
Yeah, and most of what we're taught even before independence, for the most part, is like some Ottomans here and there. In some cases, you can go further back, but for the most part, it's just like basically Western history.
Yeah,
it's World War I and World War II was pretty big in curriculum.
I should mention actually the Phoenicians. So especially with the Phalange, with Kataib, and a lot of the Maronite Christian elite. Again, like I said at the offset, nationalism often projects itself backwards because it wants to legitimize itself and say, it's not this idea I'm just coming up with. We've always been a people. And we've always been here, and we are the indigenous people. And so this is what Christian sectarian thinkers and writers and politicians do with the Phoenicians. Regardless of the fact that people have done sort of genealogical tests, and the people of Lebanon today who most have similarities like in their DNA with the Phoenicians are actually the Shia. But regardless,
that's just
point
funny.
is,
that's just for those who know, it's funny not because it's Shia, but because they're not Maronites.
they're no Maronite, but also they're the like opposite in terms of how the Maronites see themselves. Yeah, it's really important to note because that also really mirrors Zionism. Then especially in opposition, not only to Arab nationalism, which again is a major current in the region at the time, but also to like Arabs, to Islam in general. I think there's something very important to note that of all the sort of Arab countries, Arab-speaking countries, let's say, Lebanon, I think, is the only one that adopts a flag that has nothing to do with the pan-Arab, with the sort of Arab nationalism flag.
Yeah.
All of them have this mix of red, green, black, and white. And we're like, no, fuck that. Red for the blood of our martyrs, white for the snow on our mountains, cedar for our cedars,
Yeah. Hey, it's a pretty flag.
It's fine. I like I like the cedar. I like cedars. Yeah, it's a cute thing to do. But yeah, it's sort of obviously the sort of especially westernized elite, but also these Maronite elites specifically. There's a lot of antagonism with Pan-Arabism, with definitely of Nasserism. And so I think it's important to then note that in 1958, there is a little war that happens in Lebanon.
Yeah.
That has, I remember a time when I knew more about this, but there's definitely a conflict between Nasserism and essentially the sort of US, at this point, US-backed Camille Shamoun.
Shamoun, yeah. Yeah.
Tell us about it.
It's basically it's at the time when it was a conflict between a vision of Lebanon, of what Lebanon should be, allied to who and whatnot, which had a pretty large percentage of the population supporting it, and the other vision of Lebanon, which you could describe as Christian nationalism. It wasn't only Christians, but definitely dominated by them, as represented by Camille Chamoun, a very right-wing oligarch who kind of laid the seeds, I guess you can argue, for what would later on be better, or at least more widely represented by like the Jmeil clan, the sort of a very specific hyper-militaristic male Lebanese-ness that's Christian in orientation. And yeah, it's the seeds of what is to come. At the time, it wasn't between the Christians and the Palestinians, of course. This was before the expulsion of the PLO from Jordan, which it's in 1970s and whatever. But there was a bit of the proto-formations of what was to come later on in 1958, which led to the intervention of the Americans.
In 1958 as well. The Americans did invade. They put boots on the ground.
I think that's the first one. First one in the Middle East, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, shit, I think you're right. No, Suez. No.
The Americans were not on this. Were on the Egyptian side. They at least they did not interfere, but they were against at the time. They were against the Brits and French and obviously Israelis doing what they wanted to do with Suez. They were still kind of calculating whether Nasser would be on their side or not. And there was as a kind of Nasser being this third way figure, like not Soviet, not American, and so the American, that's kind of the background. But in Suez they actually supported Nasser and rhetorically and politically anyway.
Interesting. Okay.
Which is funny with the context later on, but in Lebanon it was like they were invited by the state, by Camille Chamoun, effectively.
Yeah, Camille Chamoun to defend himself. Yeah, I mean, I should mention, I guess, that when we talk about Nasser, when we talk about Pan-Arabism, this is definitely something that rises in this period specifically across the region. And you have coups that overthrow monarchs, that overthrow Western-backed dictators that are, by and large, by military men that are kind of inspired by ideas of Pan-Arabism that in one shape or form kind of unify the Arab region. And by a kind of Arab socialism. There's a lot of like anti-colonial flavors to it, but there's definitely like an Arab flavor in all of this. And it's set against not only American and European imperialism, but to Zionism, because at this point, there'd already been 10 years since the Nakba.
Yeah.
As far as I know, there was yet to be a kind of unified Palestinian resistance, but there was always essentially within what is known as the State of Israel, in 67 territories, constant low-lying, kind of like what we see in the West Bank now. It wasn't this like clean 1948 and then whatever.
No, they were under a military dictatorship, effectively, in between 67. Yeah.
No, I know, but like military dictatorship that also included like resistance and attacks on villages and
for sure.
I remember reading a short story by Hassan Kanafani that was set in like 1955, and he's talking about, it's called A Letter from Gaza, and talking about the firebombing. And I tried locating it like historically, but it just seemed like it's something that sort of was like a low-lying thing until 1964. And 1964, this does not exist in English. But this is what is the time that's referred to as the Palestinian Revolution, which is essentially the formation of Fatah, which is this umbrella group connecting Palestinian political parties and armed resistance groups to sort of unify their attempts at liberating themselves. And this is announced in Lebanon, I think in Saida. And from this, the PLO is formed. From this, the PFLP is formed. The PLO being the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Then that would be like 3 different PFLPs. That's what I mean by the acronyms becoming a nightmare later on.
I'm so glad you brought it up, because I read a really funny fact that there was this schism within the PFLP. Some people left because of George Habash's kind of authoritarian control over the group. And so they broke off and they created another group. What did they call it? Not the PFLP, the PDFLP.
Oh yes, of course.
The
Democratic
popular
Front for the.
Democratic. I love the shade.
It's so confused. There's also there's another one they added like General Command after it. I don't know. And I don't want to focus only on PFLP, but it's something that happens a lot in history.
I know, but the shade.
Yeah.
To be like, I'm gonna break off and call it the Democratic Front, like implying that you're not democratic. I just love this. It's like if you buy a vegan tomato and you're like, wait, if it's written vegan, does that mean the other ones aren't vegan? Anyway, so this starts happening. The PLO get kicked out of
Jordan in 1970 after basically kind of a mini civil war, for lack of a better term, in Jordan itself, where the PLO and local allies, Palestinians and Jordanians, of course, Jordan has a large percentage of the population that is Palestinian of origins, took up arms against the state being more and more pro-Israel at the time. They lost. There was Black September. They were exiled to Lebanon. Why Lebanon? The backstory is that basically Egypt forced Lebanon.
Oh, yeah. Okay, very good. But also that there were already so much in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of attacks and operations from Lebanon into Israel, which led to kind of agreements between the Lebanese army. This is the Cairo Agreement. Also,
yes, the Cairo Agreement, exactly.
Yeah. And so this is a sort of agreement which kind of still holds, which is like the Lebanese army will not get involved. Like, okay, you can do your rocket attacks, but there was always this antagonism with like, Tub, you're sending your rockets and we're getting bombed.
Yeah.
And there's that split between then even increasingly the we of like, we Lebanese aren't involved.
Yes.
This is your problem.
Yes.
And so these tensions form with it. This is so important. And also, I guess what's really good about this, as we're going through the history, we're giving citations. So people this isn't like a citation, it's like recommendation. Because also in the 70s, you have a labor movement in Lebanon that's been picking up, inspired by the 1968 like revolts across Europe, but across many areas. Mm-hmm. Also, I think like the success of the Algerian War of Liberation had already happened.
Yeah.
And so you had a lot of intellectuals, you had a lot of writing, but also a lot of actions, strikes, teacher strikes, worker strikes in tobacco farms, in the plants, in the factories across the country. And again, Fawwaz Traboulsi's book is really important here. He just has like numbers to show like the inequality that existed, who controlled the wealth, how much workers were making, the strikes that were happening, what people were demanding. And his summation is very important, that if there was not a civil war, there would have been a revolution in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And that's very important.
Let's get to 75.
Oh, I do want to mention, there's a video that we have on our YouTube, on the Arab Cinema playlist, called A Feeling Greater Than Love, which really captures this history very well as well.
And the title of that film is what Lina Mounzer described the 2019 uprising.
Yeah, God, I love writing.
Yeah, me too. We'll have an episode really nice one to listeners. It's something that's in the pipeline.
So the Civil War.
Yeah. Civil Wars, yeah, because I do use it in the plural. There wasn't one war. It's a bit of a misnomer. It's a series of different battles and wars and geopolitical stuff and local stuff and what have you that happened over those 15 years with lulls in between. Like there were periods that were relatively peaceful and whatever. And it started, I mean, symbolically, usually the date we start is April 13th, which is when there was the bus massacre. The bus massacre being a massacre of Palestinians, some armed, some civilians, after a tit-for-tat between the phalangists and the Palestinian militants. That's kind of the TLDR of it, if you want. But it was the launch of, at least it was the straw that broke the camel's back or what have you, but it wasn't like there was nothing before that. There were tensions were already rising. There were even assassinations and whatnot before that, especially between those two groups. There have been phases of the civil war. That's what I mean, of civil wars. And the first one, I think the one that's less known, probably at least, I think most people, if they do know anything about the Civil War, it's like 82 onwards, more or less, because it involved the Israeli invasion, of course. But 75 to 76, and you can kind of extend it to 77, is when you had the Lebanese National Movement, the LNM. And the LNM was led by Kamal Jumblatt, father of Walid Jumblatt, two very different individuals. But he was led by Kamal Jumblatt, who was a warlord and an oligarch. Like, and there's no need to downplay it, but objectively an interesting fella. He wrote a lot about, identified as a socialist, founded the Progressive Socialist Party, PSP, which is today neither progressive nor socialist, and also had like esoteric knowledge of the East and Buddhism. Interesting dude, whatever. That's a different thing. I got into him at some point just because his writing was always a bit fascinating. And as a parenthesis, because I do cinema, I studied that, there's a documentary where Walid Jumblatt is being interviewed by Philippe Araktingji. And so they go to Mukhtar is the name, where Walid Jumblatt lives. And so they go through Kamal Jumblatt's books, and they go to his library, and he had the statue of the Buddha and of like one of the Indian mystics that he was into, and I think he met when he went to India, stuff like that. But what's interesting is that Araktingji, the director, tried to get Jumblatt, like Walid Jumblatt, to sorry, a bit of a these are the things. This is good quality shit, but tried to get him to talk about his father's philosophy and interest in Eastern religions and whatnot. And Walid Jumblatt couldn't give a fuck. He didn't know what he was talking about. It's like, عنده كتب هنيك. Like, he has books over there. He was really into that stuff. I never understood it. Ask me a different question. Anyway, so it was led by Kamal Jumblatt.
And it's important to mention that the LNM is also allied with the Palestinians and with leftists and with socialists.
I was going to say, like, the LNM it's an umbrella term. It's an umbrella coalition. It includes nationalists of the pan-Arab variety, some Islamists, but Islamism wasn't that big at the time. Nasserites, as they would call themselves at the time, those are the pan-Arabists, but also the Palestinians, as you mentioned, and communists, obviously Lebanese communists and others. And against them was, I think they already started calling themselves Al-Quwwat Lebanese, the Lebanese forces, which was the umbrella term for a bunch of different, or Lebanese Front actually, Jabha Lebanese, they call themselves, for from right-wing to far-right Christian militias, from the Tigers to the Kataib to, others that I don't remember, the Danish Maroun one, whatever the names are, and Cedars of something, they all have kind of, as I said, 4 or 5 words repeated, but yeah.
But before we get into more details of it, so the question of why did it start?
Yes.
What started it? This is obviously a very sensitive topic. And again, like I said, we're only taught the leader, the president. And so this question's never fully asked because I don't want to say just because it's sensitive, but also because, very strictly speaking, what the LNM were pushing for, it's kind of haunting. I've talked about this because I read it in Fawwaz Traboulsi's book, their main 5 demands, and it was just word for word what we were talking about in 2019 during our uprising.
Yes.
Because it's quite sensible stuff where it's like, okay, this sectarian system clearly fucking sucks, clearly favors one sect, clearly favors the elite of that sect, and so we should desectarianize. We should change the quota system. We should make Lebanon one federal state, one federal electoral thing. We should remove the personal status, whatever.
Personal status laws, which continues to this day. And it's what I was describing when I said if I want to vote, I have to go to my father's village. Same here.
And so, precisely. But if I want to marry as well, I have to go to my father's village, talk to this person. It's not a state thing. The Ottomans and then the French afterwards gave these powers to these sectarian figures, down, and this is sort of the micro level of it. The mayor of the town, the Mukhtar, which is not strictly mayor, but it's the closest thing. Literally means the chosen one. But so this is what Fawwaz Traboulsi calls the period of reform by arms. Because quite strictly speaking, this was a choice by Kamal Jumblatt, by the LNM, to be okay, we tried voting, we tried doing our protests, we tried pushing for these reforms. We're going to push for these reforms with arms. But in my reading of it as well, and again, I like the way Maya Mikdashi writes this. She sums this up so concisely, more concisely than I've seen anybody. is that this early period of the Lebanese civil wars is pushed on and is essentially the attempt by the hegemonic Maronite Christian elite to retain the sectarian system, which they were benefiting.
Absolutely.
So they were fighting to protect their hegemony.
Yes. Yes, and that's why they were overwhelmingly from just one sect, whereas the others were from pretty much all of the others, including Maronites, including Orthodox, including other Christians, of course.
As people, as communities, but as the sectarian elite or the sectarian leaders.
By 76, so like 2 years into the thing, even 1 year technically, since 75 to 1976, the LNM and the Palestinian allies had kind of won most of the battles and controlled most of the territory. And that is what provoked the invasion of Hafez Assad's army, of the Syrian army. Quite literally to quote unquote protect the Christians. It's how Hafez al-Assad sold that invasion to the rest of the world, which speaks again to the links between how even Lebanon was being perceived by the rest of the world, and how any kind of revolution is obviously, even the threats of one is often, unwelcomed. And this was 76. It does change the dynamics. You have the Tel Zatar massacre of Palestinian refugees in 76. And in 1977, which is, this is how you can say the first phase of the war ended, Kamal Jumblatt gets assassinated by Hafez al-Assad.
Yeah.
And when I say by Hafez al-Assad, I mean Hafez al-Assad told Walid Jumblatt that I killed your father. It's not a secret in any way, shape or form. Walid Jumblatt was interviewed about this a bunch of different times. And it's just one of those things where, like, it's an open secret, and it's an open thing in the sense that, like, he wanted him to know, don't do this again. Don't do what your father did, effectively. Yeah. But anyway, the intervention, the crushing of the LNM, and then the assassination of its main figurehead. Maroun Baghdadi has a documentary on Kamal Jumblatt's funeral.
Also on our YouTube playlist.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Which is,
you know what song? I don't monetize any of this, but I do it just to check. Unmonetizable. You know why? Because you know what song Maroun Baghdadi plays in the opening? "Shine On You Crazy Diamond" by Pink Floyd.
What?
Yeah, for Kamal Jumblatt.
I do not remember this at all.
On you crazy.
I do not remember this at all. Anyway, yeah, it had the funeral, and Arafat spoke, yelled. He was very loud. There was the Soviet ambassador, a bunch of different people, but just it was a big thing. It was like the big assassination that signaled that, like, this is different, right? Like this is fucked, and it's not ending anytime soon. Yeah. This was kind of the symbolism of it all at the time.
Because Kamal Jumblatt, as I know him, was quite not like pragmatic, but was a kind of unifying figure who
he was.
Had ideas. Yeah, but like the whole thing of desectarianization, it's not. He wasn't like, we want to take over as Druze. As far as I know, the PSP was not like very sectarian in itself at all. But yeah, he's assassinated.
There was a vision of a progressive socialist party. There was a vision of socialism as, I guess you would call it kind of, I think you would arguably call it more like welfare capitalism, maybe in some sense, at least in today's terminology. But in any case, like, better than what the Phalangists were proposing.
But so, yeah, killing him puts us very much into the void. I think my parents describe it as there was a kind of lull for a few years. There's fighting, there's attacks. Yeah. I should mention as well, obviously, that there are massacres even of like Christian communities. The Timour massacre is the most common. So it's like, at a certain point, you really cease to have any like good principled players. And you start to get an almost new generation of people who are like raised and like politically educated through the civil war.
Exactly.
Beirut itself gets divided, east and west. There's way too many details. I'm trying to see if I don't want to skip over anything important before 82. I mean, there's a brief invasion by the Israelis in 78.
Yeah, it doesn't last too long. I think it was a week or something. But it did involve, because they do this every time they do it. They bomb the airport. They do this every fucking time. They bombed the airport, I think, 6 times.
It's fucked up. Yeah. But anyway, there is, to my mind, the most detailed and thorough documentary on the Lebanese civil wars. Again, we have a different playlist on the YouTube page where it's just 15 episodes of this documentary by Al Jazeera.
Al Jazeera, so yeah.
15 part, and it's like 10, 12 hours. And so there is a lot that we will be skipping over and that I can't remember for the life of me because like there's this party, there's this president, there's a gap in the presidency. This has regional effects. Hafiz al-Assad enters, but also you have like a pan-Arab military force in the country.
The Arab, I think they call them the Arab Defense Forces, maybe. Something like that.
I don't know, but it's like literally like Yemeni and Sudanese and Libyan forces. And there's a constant attempt to try to like quell the issues. But again, like I said, the problem that started it still exists.
Yes.
And that is the sectarian system.
Yeah.
And so the fighting didn't really let up because there was no real resolution to it. Kamal Jumblatt himself was one of the main, whatever, like you said. Very important to mention here, actually, since we've been mentioning the Shia populations in the south who are widely neglected politically, that again, throughout this period, widely neglected. I think already starting in the 60s, 70s, there starts to become forms of organizing. Shia populations tended to move towards like leftist groups because we want to absolve the system that clearly disfavors us.
Yeah.
But then there starts to be sectarian, like the rise of sectarian Shia political organizing. The most important one of which was Musa al-Sadr and the movement of the dispossessed. And this is kind of a la liberation theology, although it's very different.
Did you know that one of the founders of Amal was Grégoire Haddad?
Who's Grégoire Haddad?
Grégoire Haddad was named the Red Bishop of Beirut.
Oh.
And he was a Greek Catholic. So I mentioned I'm Maronite, I'm half, but it doesn't matter. But the Melkites, which are mostly the Catholics of Palestine, basically, but they exist in Lebanon as well. But he was like a left-wing Catholic bishop, Greek Catholic, as I mentioned, Melkite, very much kind of, I guess you might say the Lebanese version of liberation theology. He was allied with the PLO during the Civil War. And he was technically one of the founders of Amal, alongside Musa Sadr and those other two whose names I cannot remember currently. He wasn't a huge, clearly, like it was dominated by Musa Sadr. But he was there. He was in the formation of the actual movement because it was seen as a secular movement not secular is an interesting. I mean, those terms I don't like them necessarily. Secular does not mean non-religious. But let's call it cross-sectarian. Cross-religious movement that was mostly Shia because it focused on the south. But the south is a diverse place, and so it wasn't only Shias in the beginning.
Interesting. Okay, and I should say Amal in Arabic means hope.
Yeah.
But it is also an acronym. Do you know what the acronym stands for?
It's the dispossessed thing. It's when they add it together. No. What was it?
أفواج المقاومة اللبنانية الإسلامية اللبنانية. Amal.
Sure. Amal.
So the front, not the front, the battalion, the brigade.
Battalion, yeah.
The resistance brigade, Lebanon. I just like doing this. I'm sorry because it's like a pub quiz question. If I ever do a pub quiz, do you know what the acronym? So Hamas, for instance, means energy, excitement.
Yes, sure.
But do you know what that acronym stands for? You didn't know it was an acronym.
No. Say it.
حركة
الإسلامية something.
المقاومية الإسلامية حركة المقاومة الإسلامية I think
that would make sense, yes.
And it's just basically the Islamic resistance movement.
Yeah. So many names are the same. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Sorry.
But they have good so Musa Sadr movement of the dispossessed, very much so, liberation theology kind of thing of like, I mean, kind of organizing Shia populations, mostly deprived, very underdeveloped, like neglected and like exploited, but moving them, keeping them towards the church and like not to go away to the communists, to the atheists.
Yes. So it was very much the religious answer, like the mosque and the church answer to the atheistic communist versions of things, which were also very prominent among Shias of the South. Mehdi Amel was one of them. Hassan Mroueh was one of them. We can talk about what happened to them later on, but these were the two main ideological blocks in the South.
But also, like it was a very, like the Communist Party was big, and all these things.
Yes.
And so anyway, big, especially amongst the dispossessed.
Yeah.
But so there were also, I've heard, like cables between the CIA and Musa Sadr with like, hey, you're stopping the communism, so like good. Like we'd much prefer people stay within whatever.
Well, this lasted until 1978 because we wanted that in between the 70s until 82 because Musa Sadr goes to Libya on the invitation of Gaddafi, gets basically kidnapped and killed by Gaddafi.
Yeah,
and
by
then
the
and Amal gets then taken over by our good friend Nabi Hibir, who has been the leader
still
since
around.
then.
Yeah.
Who's still around.
Do you know that Saif al-Islam or one of Gaddafi's sons is still imprisoned in Lebanon
Yeah, I think I knew that. Yeah,
for like 10 years?
and Lebanon was one of the signatories of the UN resolution that led to eventually to the NATO intervention in Libya. Lebanon is the one that proposed it alongside, I think, the UK and France. Widely understood in Lebanon as basically Hezbollah and Amal's revenge on Gaddafi.
Oh, well, okay. Anyway, we've got to get through it.
These are just like these tidbits.
I know, there's too much. But 1982, this is a major turning point because Israel invades.
Yes.
They go all the way to Beirut. And they eventually settle themselves in the south for another 18 years.
Yes.
And so this is a different phase of the civil wars because it has nothing to do with Kamal Jumblatt v. the Phalange. This is a completely different thing.
It's an invasion by a foreign power into an existing civil war, but then because it's a foreign power with obviously superior power, shapes what comes next. And the excuse that the Israelis used to invade Lebanon was an attempted assassination of the Israeli ambassador in London, in the UK, by a Palestinian group that was actually opposed to the PLO. They were not buddies. But they used that in a very quintessentially Israeli way, I would say. I used that as the excuse to invade Lebanon with the stated intention of destroying the PLO.
Yeah.
And that included the siege of Beirut, obviously. I'm, as it happens, currently writing a piece on that because Mahmoud Darwish was there and he wrote about it. And long story short, I'm going to use this in an essay. But yeah, you want to continue?
No, yeah. Have you read Memories of Forgetfulness?
Forgetfulness, yeah, that's what I'm using.
I need to read that. I've heard it's very good.
It is. And so we can link this because he describes the incessant noise of the warplanes and the drone. There weren't drones, but of the warplanes, and it reminds me a lot of my friends in Beirut currently who are describing it in very similar terms. But so there was the siege of Beirut, obviously.
Siege of Beirut, and eventually they essentially starved out, and the PLO gave up and were allowed to evacuate, and they left first to Tripoli and then to Tunis.
Yes.
With that, with the expulsion of Palestinian fighters, the Israelis also wanted to install their guy, and their guy was Bashir al-Jmayil of the Kataib party,
son of Pierre, the founder.
Yeah, who was a blood and soil fascist. Who was his whole thing was Lebanon 10,452 kilometers squared.
Yes.
He was rabidly anti-Palestinian, but also had very, very direct ties to Israel, to the Israelis. I say this often, that presidents in Lebanon are only elected on the back of a tank, usually a Syrian tank, but in this case, again, very, very literally, to get the parliamentarians into parliament, especially during war, you literally need tanks.
I think they didn't meet quota or something, but it just didn't matter or something like that.
There's something.
It doesn't matter.
I remember saying that it was an illegal election and then reading and then discovering whatever. It's a back and forth. But the point is that straight up Israeli tanks, this is their guy. People hated him. He was killed by Habib Shortouni, Lebanese guy of the SSNP. Again, SSNP aren't all bad. But the Israelis instantly, and again, this documentary is so important because there's a person who was there, who I think was an Israeli journalist, who says on camera that what happened, what he saw, was a Mossad agent was digging through the rubble and screaming, "We have to find him!" Like this is literally their main guy. And in the same way with Kamal Jumblatt, like they still have their power, they still have their control, but this is the guy. This is the guy who also was actually popular. Like when I talked to my mother about it, she was 14 at the time,
Yeah.
so like quite young. He had this image of like he's gonna fix things. He's the strong man who's gonna come in and he's going to, end everything. And so there is still that.
There was the Kataib were very genuinely reminds me of Hezbollah. Well, today I don't know, things are changing very fast, but up until very recent history, very recent past, I mean, in terms of organization, they were by far the most organized of the Lebanese blocks in any case. In terms of having a structure, they had basically they adopted even a scouts, like a chef model. They had summer camps, and it progressively became very much a dear leader thing with Jmail in the middle. But because he was pretty young and charismatic in that sense, and was able to speak in this very, I think you and I would describe it as like a Lebanese Ashrafi accent.
Yeah.
He spoke to a segment of the population. That's how it is.
And also to the wider Lebanese population. I don't think Palestinians ever liked him at all, or like he literally wanted to kill them. But as in, to my mother, 14-year-old Lebanese girl, there's a kind of... Anyway.
Yeah.
So...
Warlords that are charismatic for a reason. The reason doesn't have to be good, but, should be understood.
So, and also in the context of 7 years of chaotic civil war, where it's like, okay, we need this to end, and that was, her life from 7 years old.
And as he came with the Israelis, there was very much this understanding at the time that, like, well, we hate them, but they're very strong, they're very powerful, so maybe they're going to establish some kind of order, and people, 7 years into a civil war, some people, I think, wanted to believe that.
So, as a response to this, they instantly blamed the Palestinians, and the Christian militias did Sabra Shatila, did this massacre over the course of 3 days with the Israelis.
Yes, you were going to say that,
With the Israelis, like, literally shining lights for them, besieging the camps.
Yeah, preventing any Palestinians from leaving.
Yeah, and it's the most notorious, the most horrible thing, constitutes genocide. It was just, and again, because there were no Palestinian fighters, they'd all been kicked out.
Yes. My father was there.
Red Cross?
Yes, in Safar. I think it was day 2 when they started allowing some, but they didn't allow them to do anything. So he just witnessed.
To really go in,
Yes. At the outskirts, and then and then on the 3rd day, obviously allowed to go in. So he witnessed parts of it.
So, and also reports that Ariel Sharon was there.
Yes.
Physically overseeing it. Anyway, so that's like the main massacre, I think. And again, this Al Jazeera documentary, there's a whole episode dedicated towards it. Very hard to watch, but like really important. And so then I think we can describe the next 8 years until 1990 as this kind of very messy, fucked up. If anyone has watched the film West Beirut, it's a fiction film made in the late 90s. Again, also in the playlist. I don't like the director, but the film is as a political, like later on when he does. It's a good movie. It's fantastic, and it's quite apolitical because it's from the lens of a boy.
Yeah,
it's a really good film. That is the phase of the 80s where it's just this. There's no politics. It's just this group and that group, and they keep switching. Walid Jumblatt is a perfect example of this, who just like switches from side to side. One side starts losing, so then others join that side, because there needs to be an equilibrium, very much what we still have. Because if one side loses, then we can't let them get too strong. I think obviously very, very important stuff happened in this period, but we have to go forward. 1990, the Ta'if Accord.
We can maybe just the last phase of the 80s, because they ended up defining the 90s. Very briefly, there were multiple battles, all with stupid names. You had the War of the Camps, which was Amal versus the Palestinians. You had the War of the Brothers, which were Amal versus Hezbollah. You had the War of the Mountains, which was Aoun, the Free Patriotic Movement, versus Jaja, the Lebanese forces. These are names, many of the ones I just mentioned and others, that are quite literally still with us today. And the legacy of that is part of the kind of self-mythologizing of those various parties, sectarian parties. They are relevant for a number of reasons. They're the last phase, like the late 80s, 88 roughly, I think, 89, and then 1990, are what defined who got to be in power as of 1990 with the Ta'if Agreement. The Ta'if Agreement was signed in the city of Ta'if, which is in Saudi Arabia. As it happens, it kind of sounds like Ta'ifiyya, but it is just,
No. I know, but I think I've never heard this described. Yeah, because when you look into the city of Ta'if, it's tiny. There's nothing. I think they picked it just for the name. Like, it's not Cairo, it's not Jeddah.
No.
I think they picked it because it sounds like Ta'if, which, for those that it means sectarian or sect.
Sect, yeah. The Ta'if Agreement was signed in a context where Lebanon itself was basically de facto occupied by two states. The Israelis obviously in South Lebanon and Syria de facto in the rest. I say de facto because the Syrian occupation is very different than the Israeli one. It's less kind of day-to-day. It's more administrative, except if you are in the areas where the Syrian army literally is, of course, which was especially in the Bekaa Valley. And parts of Beirut, the Mukhabarat became very notorious. Intelligence services. Basically the secret services. Anyway, they defined a number of different things, the Ta'if Agreement, and that was followed about 7-8 months later in 91. Ta'if Agreement is in 90. In 91, the Amnesty Law. So the Amnesty Law is the reason why the crimes committed by the warlords during the Civil War could not be prosecuted, because it literally said all crimes committed before a very specific date, let's say April something 1990, whatever it was, are forgiven, with the exception, and this is what I think defines a lot of the post-war status quo of Lebanon, with the exception of religious and political leaders. That's why Habib Shartouni, assassin of Bashir Gemayel, would still be prosecuted under that. He's exempted from the amnesty law because he killed a political leader. And if you've assassinated a prime minister, a Shia cleric, a Maronite bishop, what have you, you would be exempted from the amnesty law, so you would still be prosecuted.
Okay, interesting. As far as I know, the only major figure to be prosecuted for whatever was Samir Jaja of the Lebanese forces. And is that because he did a massacre of other Christians, of I think Maroun? Yeah, Daniel Maroun.
Because
was that after
politician? It did not include. Again, if you had killed a political leader or a religious leader, you would still be prosecuted under the amnesty law. Okay. And so Samir Jaja, the leader of the Lebanese forces, which is kind of the precursor of but they came out of the Phalangists. The forces were kind of the wider umbrella. The Phalangists were the biggest, but then they became their own thing. Hezbollah and Amal have a similar-ish history, but it's not as important here. Those parties, without confusing our listeners too much, for the most part, were forged in the Civil War. Some of them existed before, during the war, but the progressives, the Kataib, and much of the others existed before, but they became what they are during the Civil War. That's sort of what they ended up becoming later on. They grew in prominence, or they lost, or what have you. It wasn't during the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Those terms continued on in the post-war. So Elias Khouri, who unfortunately passed away about a month ago now, the Lebanese writer, leftist writer, and novelist, described the post-war status quo as a civil war regime. Like the regime we grew up under, the state, the status quo, nizam, the regime, is one of a civil war. They just decided through mutual agreement, with the exception of 2008 and other smaller skirmishes later on, of basically doing it non-violently. Like, we will divide the state. We kind of even prefer having one another and having, small independence and whatnot, because by the 90s, and especially up until the early 2000s, the camps were pretty well delineated. You had the Shias were basically kind of the hegemonic camp among Shias was Hezbollah and Amal, with the Christians was the Lebanese forces, Phalangists, and the Free Patriotic Movement. With the Druze, it was the Progressive Socialist Party. With the Sunnis, it was the Future Movement by Hariri, and etc. And then the smaller ones, the Armenians have their own ones, and so on and so forth. They are the state. So when you speak of the state, there's a bit of a joke in Lebanon, like Wain ad-Dawla, whereas the government is the state as a institution that's independent. Let's say of let's in theory in America you would have one Democrat for 4 years and then maybe a Republican for 4 years, but you still have the state. See what I mean? In Lebanon, you don't have it in the same way. The state is those political parties. It's not that you have no civil servants, you do, but they're very not as
That, yeah, and that there's only like a few years in the 60s. I think under Fuad Shahab's administration in the 60s
yeah, yeah, yeah.
was focused on state building.
Yes.
But essentially with the Civil War, with the complete destruction and collapse of the state, yeah, you're right. So I think there's two things to mention then to kind of help us segue, which is to just sum up the fact that the Ta'if Accord and the general amnesty essentially was just, okay, we stop now.
Yeah.
The only difference is that there was just some tweaking of the quotas of the sectarian power sharing.
Yes.
So instead of,
the executive power was a bit reduced in terms of its power, so the Maronites, quote unquote, lost.
Yeah.
That's how they would talk about it. The Speaker of Parliament, Shia, got more power than they did before. It became more of a trifecta, between the Sunni Prime Minister, the Shia Speaker of Parliament, and the President than it was before. Like if Bashir Ismail was president for longer and wasn't assassinated, he would effectively have executive power, beyond anyone else combined, right? That stopped at the end of the Civil War.
But so for a series of wars that started because of sectarianism, it ended with just a reaffirmation of sectarianism, and a kind of redoubling down and recodified and kind of balanced. And so now, like the Shia have more representation, the Muslims in general. So like there's like 5 Christian, 5 Muslim, in the cabinet or whatever. But very importantly, again, this segues us, is the prime minister who is like the unifying figure that brings the two camps together, Rafi Hariri. And this is a really important figure for the post-war era, because the joke during the uprisings, the revolution, was, he stole,
but he built.
He at least did something.
He was our thief.
Yeah, but he built like the main public hospital in Lebanon, which is still the main thing. Rafi Hariri, the airport's named after him.
It was named after him after he was killed.
Oh, what was it before?
Beirut Airport.
Okay. But so he brought with him like Saudi financing.
Yes, he was a Saudi citizen or subject technically, so is his son.
Yeah, and he was a multimillionaire. He was a very wealthy guy.
Billionaire.
Was he actually a billionaire?
Oh yeah. No, he was a billionaire. Yeah.
The 90s ushered in this era of neoliberalism. Again, the economy there, it's just that any industry, like again, thinking back on the 70s, the strikes and whatever, there were labor movements in the 90s because they could see what was happening. Those were crushed.
Yes.
And basically you had this reemergence of that sort of financialized, a lot of the banking sector things were brought back. He opened up
the Syrian regime. Hariri was an ally of Hafiz al-Assad at the time, and even of Bashar in the early years of Bashar. Then he became not so good friend, and so Bashar killed him. But in the early days, they were pretty much on good terms.
He was the compromise candidate. He was the one that could marry these sort of different camps.
Exactly.
And again, Lebanon, like why don't we have a president now? Is because there needs to be one person who everyone can agree on.
Yes.
Specifically, the two main camps. And so same thing, like we're talking about Kamal Jumblatt or Bashir Ismail, there's like that, there's a one figure and has to be of this sect, has to be of this family, has to be of whatever.
His assassination was massive. I was 14 when it happened. I went down to the streets. There was an entire segment of the Lebanese population that was basically bussed in. Like our school buses took us to the streets to protest his assassination and to demand the expulsion of the Syrian army at the time, 2005.
We'll slow down a bit.
We'll get into it. We'll get into it.
Well, this is the final stretch, but
yes.
But the 90s also, there's this very strong like liberalization of the economy, which intentionally hinders the industry, hinders any local production, and favors relying on foreign goods, relying on financialization, and on a sort of dependency of Saudi, of France, of the US.
And forcibly privatizing downtown Beirut.
Yeah.
Under Solidaire, which was his company.
Yeah. Demolishing, rebuilding. I mean, now Beirut, there's so many parts of it, like pockets of it that are like ghost buildings that are huge.
I don't know if you did, but I would just go into them. I would just, it was again abandoned. I would just go there, and because they are stunning, absolutely beautiful architecture, just to just take photos because abandoned.
Oh, I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about those new buildings that are built with Gulf financing.
Yes.
That are no one can afford them.
Of course, yeah.
No one can afford them.
Yeah, in that Beirut itself, which like almost no one lives there.
No one lives there because no one can afford it. But so you have this like emergence of new bourgeois classes. You have people emigrating, and basically the economy sort of functions like on a lot of remittances. People who have left send money back, but also this hyper financialization, which starts to form a kind of bubble. And we'll get to that a bit later on. But the roots of it are there. The bank secrecy law obviously is still a thing. The connection between the state and the banking industry.
The Lebanese lira gets pegged to the US dollar.
It does at like one. So yeah, because there was an economic collapse during the Civil War, and they kind of pegged it to the dollar. That's super fucking important because we don't have an industry to make our currency competitive, and so pegging to the dollar gives this falsehood or whatever, and it has to be forcibly kept. You know, as in. It's a very complicated economic process, but that favors it hinders local production because it kills our currency and favors a dependence on the dollar, literally, and so American imperialism and capitalism. And so
this is the 90s.
I mean, this is the 90s.
Well, this is the 90s in the rest of Lebanon. In South Lebanon, it's of course the Israeli occupation. And that's
continuous.
Until the year 2000. And that's why even when we speak of the post-war, like my first big question is like, when the fuck do you even start? Like when are we starting? Like we can say maybe 2005. I would say it's more fair in terms of if you want to have like a unified objective, whatever, but even then it's complicated. But anyway, South Lebanon was still occupied by the Israeli army and their collaborators, the South Lebanon army by Abdullah Had, who unfortunately was not assassinated by Sohaf Shara, but almost.
She tried.
Good for her. Anyway, that lasted until the year 2000, of course. Included the Kana massacre in 1996, the Hisham prison at the border, which they would later bomb again during the 2006 war. And that is kind of the prelude for like why there is such a thing as Hezbollah in the first place. Like where does it come from? And without that history, which is a parallel, like it's a history that is specific to South Lebanon, that's of course parallel to and part of the history of Lebanon, but it is separated in many ways through the self-mythologizing of Hezbollah as well, but because there was quite literally a military occupation that like if you're not from there, it was very difficult for you to go there. Because of the Israelis and their collaborationists. And this is until the year 2000. Hezbollah and Amal were already two separate parties by then, and they had an agreement between them. Amal would do politics stuff, Nabi Habibi being Speaker of Parliament since then to this day, and and Hezbollah would focus on quote-unquote non-politic stuff. This was an agreement that was also reached with the Syrians and the Iranians because Hezbollah was backed by Iran, Amal by Syria. They fought each other, Hezbollah won, and this was the compromise. This, of course, changed after the years 2000, especially after 2005, when Hezbollah joins the government properly and becomes part of the political system properly, like the other sectarian parties.
Yeah, because I remember for a time, basically, like Amal was the Syrian Shia sectarian group, and Hezbollah was the Iranian Shia sectarian resistance group. But Hezbollah forms in 82.
82, 83, and I think formally 85, but basically.
And so, our resistance group, because there was a full actual invasion, and successfully, alongside others, including the Communist Party, including others, smaller batches, successfully kicked out, made the occupation unbearable for the Israelis, unsustainable, and through their guerrilla tactics. And just one day, the Israelis up and left. There's that footage from this documentary on Sahab Shara, Surviving Hell, wherein you see people going to the prisons, and the prisoners are still inside the prisons.
Because they break them up. They were abandoned by the prison guards, which was the SLA, the Lebanese, the South Lebanon army. They were taken with the Israelis to Israel, and that's why you have Lebanese Israelis today, second generation. There you can find interviews of them on YouTube, which are objectively interesting to listen to because it feels like they're from a completely different universe, basically. But anyway, yeah, the liberation of Khiam prison, Khiam itself being a notorious torture site. The Israelis bombed it in 2006 during the war because they probably wanted to hide more evidence or whatever. And the years 2000, between 2000 and 2005 were relatively, all of this is emphasis, relatively peaceful in Lebanon. Not much happening compared to the 90s and certainly after 2005. In 2005, February 14th, 2005, fucking Valentine's Day, which is a bit of a dark joke in Lebanon, Rafiq al-Hariri gets assassinated.
The one-ton explosion, which I was very close to.
Oh, okay.
School, I was at school, and it's ACS, so it's like on the Corniche.
Yes.
That was my first explosion.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was in Ain Najm, which is in the mountains, and we heard it, and the building like moved and shit. It was very, I mean, because it's a wadi, so it's like a valley. So like you just see Beirut, and there's like almost nothing in between you, but it's just far away. And we saw the explosion. And it was a massive thing. Yeah. And that's February 14th, 2005, widely believed to be Bashar al-Assad. There's no reason why it would not be him. The threats were pretty open even before his assassination. And it was followed promptly by a series of assassinations that technically never really stopped. Like you can include Luqman Slim's assassination in early 2021 in that series of assassination, where the only thing they really had in common, the people who were assassinated or almost assassinated, was that they were kind of vocally anti-Syrian regime. Some are leftist figures like Samir Osir, who was the first one to be killed after Hariri, George Howie being the second one to be killed after Hariri. But you also had like Bashir Gemayel Jr., Pierre Gemayel Jr., the son of Bashir or nephew, whatever, who was gunned down. And you had like a bunch of different right-wing figures as well. Again, the only thing they had in common is opposing this regime.
And I mean, George Howe is a really interesting one because he was a communist. Like he was
the Secretary General of the Communist Party. Yeah. And he and Asir and Elias Khouri, who unfortunately passed away, and Ziad Majid and others, Ziad Majid, who we've had on the Friday Times, founded what is the acronym again? Lebanese Democratic Front, something, like which were like ex-communist socialists and whatnot, forming a different leftist front. Okay, 2005. Why does it matter? The big guy. He was even called like fucking Mr. Lebanon by some idiots, and he was assassinated. And arguably, I think if you wanna think of it, like I don't like this sort of timeline, like because it becomes like great man of history kind of thing. But of course, like the assassination of Jumblatt in 1977 was massive, of Gemayel in 1982 was massive, Hariri's was massive in 2005, and now Nasrallah's in 2024 is massive. And so we're seeing also parallels of that, obviously. But it was a shock in the sense of like he was seen as the politician. There was no one like him in terms of equivalent influence and power. And the proof is that when he died, when he was killed, I mean, the March 14 coalition, before it was co-opted specifically in what it became in parliament, but was a pretty genuinely popular thing that happened, a popular movement that included folks like Samir Osir and Jabran Twaini and others, and of course those figures. But it included the Hariri, like his son, of course, and included Walid Jumblatt, who has a hilarious speech on March 14th, 2005. You can find it on YouTube if you want, where he recites a poem, and you see him losing the crowd because they're not as interested. They want someone yelling, and at some point he insults like Bashar al-Assad himself and calls him a snake or something like that, and the crowd goes wild. It's hilarious. Yeah. I was there. I just don't remember I was 14, but it's one of those things that you just find on YouTube.
But I mean, so
that's 2005.
Like, moving away from the great man history of it all, he did usher in what felt like and materially was a kind of a sort of successful, like what's the word, of abundance, like the economy was picking up, things were happening, there was whatever. People
who were abroad came back. I was born in France in 1991. My parents decided to go back to Lebanon. There was very much a sense of like things are being rebuilt, things are better, stuff like that. And you actually had a return of a sizable segment of the diaspora that you've never had before or since. There's never been anything like it. So I do understand people who had that kind of optimism, obviously, with them.
There's an optimism, but I think materially, like they're sort of, because a lot of these things were short term and it relied on investment, but like I think a lot of these indexes went up and whatever. There was money in the country and whatever. and because of him, there was investment. But we came back as well. I was born in Saudi Arabia. My parents left in 1988, and I got married and left to Saudi. And then, we went back 2004, 2003, 2004. But so, and so
the reason why 2005 is significant is that, hey, he was assassinated, but also because what came out of that assassination is two major coalitions, March 14 and March 8. They don't quite exist anymore in this. They have different acronyms and whatnot. And for one, like Future Movement, Hari has actually joined Hezbollah and Aman late. So it doesn't quite exist in the same way. But roughly speaking, they were political parties, political movements that brought in different sects and whatnot that primarily defined themselves vis-a-vis how they viewed the Syrian regime. That's broad strokes of it all. They're all overtly, de facto right-wing in terms of economics. Like none of them are not capitalists. They're all capitalists. There was an exception within March 14 of the Samir Osir and George Howie who were trying to shift things and unfortunately obviously failed and were assassinated. But that was part of what they were trying to do in the early days of 2005. And there was the formation of those two groups, March 8, March 14. March 8 initially was almost exclusively Hezbollah and Amal. And then joined by Michel Aoun's Free Patriotic Movement after the Maroun agreement between Nasrallah and Aoun. Long story short, you had at some point for most of, this is a generalization because it did shift a lot, but for most of those 15 years, let's say between 2005 and 2020, you had the March 8 and March 14. And March 8 was Amal, Hezbollah, the Shia duo, called in Lebanon, everything sectarian, and the Free Patriotic Movement, or the Aouniyya, we would just call them the people of Aoun, the Aounists. And on the March 14 side, you had the Future Movement, i.e. Hariri's party. His son, Saad Hariri, took over. He's also a billionaire prime minister. You had the Progressive Socialist Party, again, neither progressive nor socialist, allied with the billionaire by Walid Jumblatt. And of course, you had the Lebanese forces with Samir Jaja being released from prison. You mentioned he was the only one prosecuted, who was imprisoned. Pretty horribly detained and tortured. It was not a good time. And it is part of his self-mythologizing as well. He paid his dues or whatever. And he was released in 2005. Michel Aoun was in exile in France for 15 years for resisting, in his narrative, Hafiz al-Assad's army, and then hiding in the French embassy in Ashrafiyeh, and then getting exiled and coming back in 2005. So 2005, you had the coming back of those big Christian figures, which for me was a big deal. I was in this private Catholic school because that's when we started having those two big names kind of coming back. Well, for me, I discovered them. I didn't know who they were. And I remember very clearly because everyone in school was talking about them. It's like, are you Inta Maroun? Are you with Aoun? Are you with Jaja? That sort of thing. And you had parents, when they would pick up their kids, would do the honking shit, ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, shit like that. And I remember once my mom was picking me up from school. I was 14. And I tell her, Mom, Nahna Maroun or Ma Jaja? Are we with Aoun or with Jaja? And she stops the car, yells at me. Yells at me and says, none of those, fuck them, all of that shit. That's how I knew she was cool. But it was a common thing. And you had people who were on those later on become sworn enemies again. That's kind of on good terms. They're the Christians talking. And it was before Aoun allied himself in the early 2006 with Hezbollah. This was Maroun
2016.
No, 2006. 2006. But between Aoun and Nasrallah, there's a nice photo of them in Maroun Khail, one of the last times Nasrallah would go outside.
But isn't the memorandum of understanding between them, wasn't that 2016 when they then formed the coalition?
No, 2006. That's how Aoun joined that camp, basically. In the early days, Aoun was kind of the March 14 camp, but he joined that camp after that. And then the 2006 war happens. And that's a different dynamic altogether as well, because obviously Hezbollah and Israel had the war for 33 days or so. A month or so. I remember as a teenage idiot, it was right after the World Cup, the football one. And I remember I was pretty insulated. The war was not where we were living, but we got the aftershocks in the sense that we can go to my grandmother's floor on the first floor and I could just see the fucking Israeli warplanes. I just see them. Yeah. They're very easy to see and dropping bombs on Beirut. Yeah. So that's 2006. Obviously, a massively horrible and destructive war, especially if you're in Dahiya, the south, and the Ba'a. That's where Israel develops its Dahi doctrine. Let's not focus on it too much. I did another episode on that. But 2008 happens, and that's when you had the mini civil war, which is a stupid term, but like Harb al-Ahliya Zriri, the small civil war, that effectively, when Hezbollah militarily took over part of Beirut and Mount Lebanon. The context for that is that you had the Senior government, which was allied with the Saudis, and they were, but they argued basically saying that the telecommunications network by Hezbollah is being used by Iran to spy on Lebanon. Probably not wrong, but they were saying so because they had different priorities. George W. Bush was the president at the time, Saudis aligned, and they were very much anti-Hezbollah. Nasrallah, goes on TV and basically declares war on the state, and they militarily take over parts of Beirut and Mount Lebanon. That's when you start seeing the SSNP flags in Hamra. They were not there before, and so on and so forth. And we're kind of still in that in many ways from 2000.
I mean, it ends with the Doha agreement.
The Doha agreement, yeah. Which then reshuffled. A new president was elected after, and the whole who elects a president is always kind of it. There's a long history of like shit hits the fan. There's no president, and then they elect someone. He's president for a bit, and then all of that stuff.
So I think a lot of this basically, and what I was describing, I said that Rafi Hariri ushered in this kind of like era of I don't know, I still can't think of a word, of like wealth, whatever. Is that a lot of it was built on very shady grounds, on shitty economics, whatever, but also the sort of the sectarian parties' agreement with each other. I think a lot of this then ends or comes to a head in 2019. With the October 17 revolution in Lebanon, wherein it is this moment of awakening where it's like, we are not sects. Like it is a class thing. They are fucking all of us. They are destroying this country. They are destroying us. They're, and
it's the first explicitly widespread anti-sectarian uprising in Lebanon.
Yeah, which included anti-capitalism, which included a lot of feminist protests, which was widespread across the country. It wasn't just Beirut, because there's a lot of marginalization of different whatever. And so much shit happened. But what's really important is that this was a moment of rupture when the state, as in all the combination of all these parties, really revealed itself as a regime, as a unit, as something that is willing to protect itself against its real enemy, the people.
Yes.
Or not just its enemy.
Nasrallah within the first week or so went on TV and says, like, quite literally, هيدا العهد مش راح will not collapse. Like مش راح ينتهي, something like will not collapse. Like this era will not collapse. And like 2 weeks later, Saad Hariri resigns, the prime minister. So it did collapse in that sense.
Yeah. But like they've lost grip of it, but also they've revealed themselves completely, because again, there's just. We were all there, and also again across the country, in the south, in the north, in the mountains, in the Ba'a, in Lebanon, in Beirut, and I mean the thing that actually I think to me, what I remember being one of the main triggers. Obviously, there are a lot of triggers, not the WhatsApp thing. I mean, even the WhatsApp thing, like this sort of neoliberal, like taxing literally WhatsApp, and so you had people
something that's free.
Something that's free, but it's also like you've literally forced half of our family and our friends to migrate because you fucked this country and everything, and you've just gotten wealthy off its back.
And of course, the reason why WhatsApp was this widespread is that there's a duopoly between the two telecommunications network that became more and more expensive. That's why WhatsApp was being used the most.
Exactly.
MTC and Alpha.
It's a complete duopoly, exactly. And so, there's also this thing of. Yeah, the forest fires.
The dudes. The forest fires, of course.
So, like, literally, the country was burning, and we had to get a helicopter from Cyprus. There was that feeling, and there was this huge fundraiser. I remember that so well. There was that one moment where it's like the geography is on fire. Like, regardless of what area, there's no sect, there's no class, it's just, we are on burning.
They did try to turn it into a sectarian thing. They did try and say, like, only the Christian areas are burning, which was fucking Shuf, which is like Druze majority. Only, their own people said that, and they started blaming Syrians for like moving into burning Lebanese home because Syrians are fireproof. and shit like that. Like this was a thing. It was they definitely tried to play that card, but it didn't work. That's the point. It was October 13th, 14th, more or less, from what I was there. From what I remembered, 3 days and then it rained. We got lucky. It started raining as well.
We were saved by the gods.
Exactly. And then the WhatsApp thing happened, and that was like just khalas. Like this was just the straw that broke the camel's back.
There had already also been some mobilizations up until that point, but
yes.
This was a breaking point. And again, the things that people were demanding, so many similarities with what the Lebanese national movement were demanding in 1975, because those things, they understood the system. They understood its faults, and they understood what to do about it. And it just never got addressed. A war happened. They decided to do a war to save the sectarian state. The different nations got involved, different states got involved to protect this system because they benefit from it. And essentially, what really revealed itself in 2019 and then afterwards is that we still have the same formulation, that there is a sectarian elite against the entire population, and it needs to be protected by force because it creates so much opposition. And as the Syrian regime used to be the protectorate of the sectarian system, now, for the last few years, it's been Hezbollah. They are the protector, the military wing of the state to protect the state.
To be honest, right now, I have no idea what's going to happen after this current horror, but up until last month. Let's put it that way.
I know. It has gotten difficult. I'm very separated from things. Like I keep reminding myself that he's dead.
Yeah.
And it is different, obviously, and it's hard to talk about. That's why I'm glad this is like later in the episode a bit, but it's also like now with an actual new invasion. But also because I have no idea. Are you watching this new guy's speeches? Because they suck.
I'm Qasim. He spoke yesterday. It was just released today. It was actually pre-recorded.
I know, but he's got.
It doesn't quite matter as much. Safieddine is almost definitely dead. His Nasrallah's cousin, who was supposed to be the successor.
Do you think so?
And probably, I don't know. I mean, this could be wrong, but it seems to, at the very least, if he is alive, they're not mentioning it. And for now, there's not going to be a new leader. I don't think there will be a new leader for like some time until there is a ceasefire of some kind and they do a proper ceremony for Nasrallah, because I don't think they will do anything before that happens. And who knows what follows after that? I have no idea. Whatever happens before is like what we're talking about is roughly until 2024. More or less, the Hezbollah we're talking about. After that, I don't know it's very difficult to predict.
But so with the, because a lot of the protests were also of an economic nature because already starting, I remember the summer of 2019, there already been not just so many new taxes and economic reforms and proposals, but also like a cracking down of Syrian migrant labor and Palestinian migrant labor. And there was already a protest happening in the Palestinian camps. This is an erased precursor to the Lebanese uprising.
Yes. And the Lebanese uprising itself, the fires that occurred on the October 17th, I believe the night of 17th, 18, you had some buildings that were on fire, killed a number of Syrian workers.
During the first few days, yeah.
Yeah, first
no
night,
one considered them martyrs.
Yes, exactly.
But so, again, yeah, we have skipped over quite a bit in terms of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, Palestinian refugees and their oppression.
The role of Hezbollah in Syria and the way Palestinians are scapegoated in the post-war status quo. Definitely lots of different elements to this.
But so currently, and so obviously then economic collapse, a lot of the stuff that Hariri built up just collapses. The peg gets unpegged. And so now we have hyperinflation. My entire life...
It's like 96%, I think.
It's 90,000 lira for the dollar. I don't know if it's changed in the last few days, but I remember for the last period, for like months, it sort of stabilized at 90,000. And so anybody who's getting paid...
For those who don't know, it was 1,500 for basically all of our lives.
1,500. I sort of loosely call us the peg generation. Because so much of my understanding of the world is based on 1,500.
And that's why we're all so good at maths. We always had to calculate.
Yeah, now it's 90,000 and it's unbelievable, but it's kind of being dollarized. And so there was a lot of protests like predicting this, but against this as it was happening. The protests slowly died out because I think there was a lack of like new tactics and like low successes, and also Corona fucking virus hit in 2020.
Yeah. We had 3 months of protests on January a bit of 2020, but then there was fucking COVID, and that most people, of course, in the early days did not know what was happening.
I know. No, but it only hit in March, and it would already been
in
dying
March.
out in like as in like street protests. But
Yes.
but then things were picking up a bit, and like some of the organizing was going towards COVID response. Then the port explosion in August 4th, which honestly,
You were there. I wasn't.
oh yeah, you weren't.
No, I wasn't. I was already here.
No, I was very, very much so there. I was at a thing the other day, like a party. I mostly just stand outside and smoke, but it was like a lot of queer Arabs, a lot of Lebanese. Some people were like, "This feels like we're in KED, like in some club in Lebanon." A fucking Italian guy asked me when I said I was from Beirut. He asked me, "Were you there during the port explosion?" I wanted to spit in his face. Like, what kind of fucking question? First of all, it's 4 years ago. Second of all, fuck you. Third of all, anyway, it was horrible.
Yeah.
But killed, I think, 231 people, injured thousands, displaced tens, if not hundreds of thousands. And again, it was the kind of pinnacle of the collapse, even though the collapse is still happening. But it was this literally everything is collapsing. The currency is collapsing, the economy, the politics.
We called it the inhiar, the collapse. That was literally the term that was used. There were even some dark jokes about it, like رايحين على انهيار ايه بس البوس جاكيت, you know. That's stupid Lebanese shit, but it has been viewed as an actual collapse in that sense. Like the world, there's like a before and after, basically.
No, and we're still very much in it. And I remember I personally left Lebanon after the explosion because I was like, I can't do this anymore. But it wasn't just the what's it called? For some reason in this period, months after Israel, like Israeli jets started like circling overhead every now and then, especially after 2021. I think in March or May, there was another assault on Gaza. And so that started becoming a regular thing, these jets overhead. And it was driving me crazy. And I don't know, a lot of shit happened. We haven't had a president in 2 years. Like now we're getting up to the present moment. I mean, okay, up until a month ago, because the last 2-3 weeks have been fucking unbelievable.
Yeah. Speaking of before and after, this is going to be a different one, before and after.
Or at least a year, because with the low-lying aggression in the south, the killing of journalists, and So I don't know, I think that's quite as thorough as we can do for one episode of just like, let's go through from 1860. I can't believe we did it. I hope people enjoy this or appreciate it, because what the problem with knowing this history, and again, now Lebanon being on the fucking headlines, I go to a fucking hardware store run by Turks and it's just Lebanon, Udzi, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, y'all are talking about it.
It is a weird situation right now, specifically to just see Lebanon in the news a lot. Because there's never a good. It's never good. It's never like for good. You know, it's never like, oh, Lebanon is in the news because whatever, we discovered the pyramid. You know, it's just no. It's like because we're being fucking bombed by the Israelis. That's basically why we're in the news, or because there was a port of Beirut explosion.
No, exactly. And so, like for instance, people are only discovering the Druze because they were attacked by whoever. And then like I, as a Druze, find myself online, you know, being like, wait, do you want to know, or do you just want to exploit our what's it called? And so,
well, there is very much for me the same as, you know, the whole Israel is protecting the Christians and against the Shias and all of that shit, and it's like I don't want to talk about this, and I don't want to, but I feel like I have to, because otherwise, I mean, they are using me, effectively using our communities and shit. But anyway, whatever. We will have more in-depth episodes on those specific things, I'm sure. I will say that like I'm writing more on this specific topic as a way of coping. By tomorrow, today's October 15th, I think tomorrow I will release an essay on the ontologist thing that I've been writing, the newsletter. that's specifically about the 82 siege and the parallels of it since then. You did an episode with Justin Sarhani.
Yeah.
We should say on Friday Times actually a few months ago.
Based on his article.
Yeah.
But no, I'm appreciative of the fact that we did do this thing of like, here's an overview that's rooted in the present moment, but also from a leftist perspective, as in like a kind of empathetic, like not just geopolitics or not with a specific angle in mind where it's like, we just hate the Christians or we just hate Hezbollah so much. That's like, so I think that's necessary, even though as I was listening to you speak and listening to myself speak, I was like, are people going to follow this? Because like, there is a fucking lot. And
well, listeners, if you've made it this far, well, kudos.
Thank you so much. You're the real ones.
Thank you. You're the real ones. You've survived. Good for you.
But no, I think this is good, and we'll probably do another, like maybe even like a mini series, where I can do some research, or we do research and like then actually do one episode. 1880, 1910, or 1920, you know?
Yeah. Did you know about the 15 years thing? As a, like, let's say, and final thing for listeners as well, is that roughly Lebanon's history of the past, whatever, has been roughly in a 15-year cycle, more or less. It's not quite 15, but like 58, 43 to 58, first 15 years, then 58 to 75. Okay, fine, it's not 15, 17. But then 75 to 1990, Civil War. 1990 to 2005, Hariri gets killed. 2005 to almost 2020, you had the uprising, and then the shit show in 2020.
Yeah.
And whatever the fuck is happening now.
We're in a weird, like, cosmic nightmare.
Anyway, listeners, thank you for listening and supporting and all of that stuff. We will release this on the public feed, so because it is we feel like we did this not just for like the two of us, but it is something that unfortunately is in the news for all of the wrong reasons, but because of that I feel like we have a duty to talk about it in ways that are more nuanced than is often the case. If you are a paid subscribers of From the Periphery, thank you, you're awesome. If you're not, you're still awesome, I'm sure, but consider doing that if you want or can on patreon.com/From the Periphery, or if you're on Apple Podcasts, you can do so directly there, I believe. Well, no, I believe you can. And I don't know, final words, it sounds so dramatic, but like anything you want to add?
Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, everyone. This has been another episode of the Fairouz Times. If you like this podcast, please consider leaving a 5-star rating or review on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. For $5 a month, and even less if you opt for the yearly subscription, you can help this ecosystem grow and get early access to all episodes of the Fairouz Times, Politically Depressed, Obscuristan, and Khida, as well as an invitation to join our monthly hangout, watch parties, upcoming book club, as well as exclusive episodes. Thank you for listening, and take care, everyone.